I mean, very briefly introduce Chelsea because really Chelsea needs no introduction. Everybody knows Chelsea, but I still want to say a few words. Just to kind of work. She's been publishing journals, outlets she's been publishing in. So Chelsea came to us as a postdoctoral fellow from Cornell University, where she got her PhD in communication. Her research investigates how people use digital media technologies to make sense of their identities during a period of widespread social change and crisis. This has led her to study elections, presidential elections, COVID-19 pandemic, social movements, and the politics of digital storytelling in everyday life. Her articles have been published in journals such as New Media and Society, Social Media and Society, Visual Communication, Feminist Media Studies, and Communication, Culture, and Critique. So today, Chelsea will be speaking to us about this is the title of the talk: Identity in Crisis: Digital Self-Making During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So with that, I'll turn this over to Chelsea.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I interrupted the moment, the weird moment. Anyway, hi, thank you so much for the introduction. I want to talk to you today, and I'm so excited to talk to you about identity in crisis, trying to imply identity crisis, identity during crisis. Woohoo, I'm so glad to chat with you about this topic and about this paper. Let's see if it looks like the remote is not working anymore, but I will take this and use it instead. Or it works. Okay. So I want to start off by showing you a couple images. So in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, many of the online figures that social media users tend to look up to the most received a simultaneous wave of criticism and hate. Vanity Fair asked, "Is this the end of influencing as we know it?" While the New Yorker touted the public shaming pandemic. Previously devoted followers and journalists turned on influencers and celebrities like Kendall Jenner for their responses to COVID-19, scolding them for throwing parties against lockdown guidelines, modeling unsafe behavior on social media, and leading lavish lifestyles during a time of economic turmoil. However, the backlash was not limited solely to influencers or celebrities either. Ordinary people also turned on one another based on networked social media behavior, scrutinizing their Twitter and Instagram profiles for questionable pandemic practices. To the extent that COVID vigilante accounts emerge across social media platforms to aggregate and amplify these criticisms, such as a popular Instagram account originating in the gay community known as Gays Over COVID, which reposted photos of gay men at risky social gatherings, sometimes including their names or tagging their employers to draw attention and further shame to these individuals breaking COVID guidelines. The account received its own backlash in the form of the anti-public shaming account, Gays Over COVID. So at least that happened. Concerns about pandemic self-representational norms on social media extended into personal social networks and anxieties. One of my research participants, Remy, who is pictured here but covered, described a dilemma she encountered in summer 2020 when, after months of physical isolation, she was able to meet a few friends for a face-to-face outdoor gathering at the beach. And she deemed this safe, wanted to document that time together with an Instagram photo. But she was nervous about how her followers might react. Would they shame her for seeing others in person amid a surging virus? Should she be wearing a mask? How far apart is 6 feet? Together, Remy and her friends stage a photo and the story that it told about their gathering through a simultaneous calculus of disease and social risk management. This is evident in the Instagram post she eventually shared, which shows them smiling and standing a few feet apart with a caption that jokingly asks how to take a socially distanced photo. Looking back on the photo as it appeared on her Instagram profile over a year and two vaccine doses later, Remy said these measures felt both funny and necessary, given changing pandemic norms. So these stories really showcase the sort of intense social stakes of personal digital storytelling during the pandemic. And they lead me to ask, how did the COVID-19 pandemic alter identity-based digital storytelling on social media? And how do social media platforms shape our recollections of personal pandemic narratives? So I'm going to talk through this project in 3 or 5 major parts, I should say. So first, I'll start with a bit of background on the project. Then I will talk about social media scrollback interviews as the method that I was using. From there, I will discuss offline sociality and the outcomes that we saw in that regard. And then moving into online practices and self-representation. And finally, I will talk about some conclusions and future directions. So the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have been disruptive and devastating, both in the US and across the world, including rapid changes to personal communication and sociality. These transitions are rooted in safety regulations to prevent the spread of COVID-19 through tiny airborne droplets. The most iconic and visible regulations that we saw were wearing a mask in public spaces to cover one's nose and mouth, and social distancing, or staying at least 6 feet apart in public places, or from people who are outside of one's household. So these regulations reshape the ways that people interact with others face to face, limiting how and where people were able to socialize. This included changes like moving school and work online for many people. And at the same time, the pandemic social transformations and their impacts were not evenly distributed. It magnified many forms of inequality surrounding issues such as internet access for work and school, health inequality, and racism. And while some people, particularly those working white-collar jobs, were committed to work from home, others, including many in the service industry, were deemed essential workers, requiring them to continue assuming the risk of working in person. So changes to life and questions of health and safety looked very different based on factors such as race, class, and ability. In the US, masking and social distancing guidelines became contentious, and they were unevenly enforced and practiced. While some people followed the guidelines to the letter, others questioned their effectiveness or the veracity of the pandemic in general. This graph from a Pew study from October 2020 shows that responses to the guidelines often broke down along partisan lines, developing a politicized character for conservatives and for liberals. But regardless of a person's political beliefs, deviations from pandemic guidelines were not just questions of health and safety. While everyday interactions are always already political, involving negotiations of power, there were new questions. Decisions to do things like host a birthday party or go to a concert or even post a photo of friends on social media gain new layers of moral and political significance. This study on the pandemic is part of a larger project I'm working on that compares how social media shapes different kinds of intersections between political events and everyday life, including elections, social movements, crises, and mundane political talk. And so I think about COVID in this sort of framework as a question of the politicized everyday. As I said earlier, although everyday interactions and self-presentation are already political, there are these new politicized considerations of everyday social interaction that are coming into question with the pandemic. And I want to mention here as well that the timeline for this study is really focused on the US during the first year and a little more of the pandemic. I like to think of it as the pre-Omicron era. So this is roughly March 2020 through December 2021. And so any considerations about masking and social distancing are situated in that era and not necessarily commenting on the way that things are now, as Omicron as a variant kind of changed the game in a lot of ways. In terms of thinking about how interaction was changed during the pandemic, thinking about it even from a level of self-presentation and impression management gives us a chance to take this apart a little bit. So self-presentation or impression management describes how people consciously and unconsciously use social and cultural norms and context clues to control the impressions that others will form of them. And as we can see from these stock photos here, COVID-19 rewrote a lot of the social guidelines that we need to follow to make a good impression in public, essentially overnight. And different people had different values about how these rules should be enacted. As I said earlier, sometimes we had entirely new rules coming about, like the expectation to mask in public spaces. And other times we had the rewriting of old existing expectations and norms of interaction. Like, for example, a handshake is generally considered to be a polite way to greet someone, but instead we had to move toward the elbow bump, the foot bump, as another potential way to do so, according to these stock photos anyway. In times of crisis and political change, beyond the in-person sociality of self-presentation and impression management in this sense, people have turned to everyday media production, not only to share information, but also to collectively witness, document, and cope with large-scale disruption as it reshapes their lives. This practice dates back to personal media like scrapbooks and photo albums that originated long before social media as we know it today, or the COVID-19 pandemic. But digital platforms also extend the reach and reshape the manifestations of these practices of self-mediation. User-generated images have proven to be an especially powerful yet controversial tool for producing personal narratives of disruptive events. We see evidence of this in the conflictual discourses that follow widely circulated selfies and other visual depictions of ordinary people as they experience ongoing disasters or political milestones. We've got funeral selfies, we've got natural disaster selfies, we've got Capitol insurrection selfies. And as Barbie Zelzer argues, personal photos of cultural traumas allow people to bear witness to difficult events and connect them with a wider collective in order to process and move toward recovery from these traumas. These images assert a form of personal agency in out-of-control situations through the act of digital self-representation, which, as Nancy Thummim says, contains a challenge to the idea that it is the job of one set of people to represent another set of people. So what is self-representation or digital self-representation? It is the fairly conscious process of creating and circulating media traces about oneself. It draws from tradition of representation in media studies, linguistics, and cultural theory, the sense that media can represent a person or a group, focusing on the idea of creating media traces of that personal group that can stand in for and simultaneously reconstitute that person's identity. And these traces are these indexical texts that can indicate our presence, existence, or action through media. However, the social significance of self-representation is not limited to its truth value or its immediate context of production. Instead, its significance emerges through the gradual accumulation of personal media traces connected to specific moments in time and bound to those moments. The process of revisiting and reinterpreting these traces over time contributes to the formation of a broader sense of the self through media. And digital media and digital self-representation are typically studied through visual, written, or quantitative formats. In this case, I'm going to focus on visual and written self-representation during the COVID-19 pandemic. So Nancy Thummim discusses the implications of self-representation as both political and therapeutic. On one hand, the notion that self-representation is political gets at the idea that when we create media text based on our everyday lives, we are making a value judgment about what is worthy of recording and sharing, include everything from an I voted selfie to an avocado toast, as well as what deserves visibility and display and what deserves to be private, what should be hidden, what is worthy and of privacy, what is worthy of display. And it also involves drawing attention, celebrating, and potentially normalizing identities, concerns, and issues that are sometimes ignored or overlooked in mass media or other forms of media narratives and cultural narratives. On the other hand, with self-representation as therapeutic, we can see self-representation as an act of expression, an expression of opinions and beliefs, a sense of an opportunity for connection, an opportunity to cope with trauma or change, as I was saying earlier. And with this comes the presumption that self-representations are true to who we are, an authentic version of ourselves, which is not necessarily always the case, but it gives us a sense that self-representation can have these connective and therapeutic aspects to it. That said, when we're thinking about the production of digital media text in everyday life, we also have to consider the platforms and the spaces of digital interaction where these texts are circulated. And so we see self-representations shaped by the technological affordances of these platforms, meaning the perceived uses and constraints linked to the features of a technology. So in this case, according to Dana Boyd, we see social media making the content that we can produce and share persistent, and that it's going to have a lasting presence, searchable, and that it can be found and connected with through various forms of search and searched textually or in other ways. It can be replicated and split up into small chunks, shared, and it's scalable. It can have visibility far beyond what one might expect initially. At the same time, social media platforms also capitalize on imperatives towards self-representation by selling our data. So when we share a photo or another text, we are also in some ways participating in this system by contributing to affective capitalism, or as Alison Hearn discusses it, affective capitalism is quite literally run on the fuel of individual feeling and self-expression taking place online, and self-presentation is now a crucial part of the economic infrastructure. It's this kind of imperative to express oneself also being tied to the profit of platforms and companies. That said, the point is that self-representation is both complicated and also this coping strategy and opportunity to make oneself visible. So in thinking about self-representation during the pandemic, there's also a question of where self-representations are stored and how they can be revisited in order to build a larger sense of the self. And I study them through the social media profile as a space for compiling the digital self-representations of the pandemic. So that includes tweets, posts, photos that share a person's identity for other users and for their own later re-engagement. So driving this project, I have two major research questions. I know I posed some questions at the beginning of the talk, but these are the questions that specifically are the focus of my project. So first, how did people experience and practice digital self-representation on social media during that pre-Omicron period of the COVID-19 pandemic? And second, how did the technological affordances of social media profiles shape their practices and recollections of pandemic self-representation? So to answer these questions, I used a method called social media scrollback interviews, originating from the work of Sean Lincoln and Brady Robards. This method combines in-depth interviewing with observational research, and it involves scrolling backward through research participants' own social media profiles alongside them. So the purpose of the method is to observe long-term change over time through the lens of the participants' own recollections and accounts of their profiles, as well as the user interface of the profiles themselves. It's like a tour of the profile history that allows the participant to serve as a co-analyst of their own digital self-representations, while me, as the researcher, asks sensitizing questions. And in this case, I encourage participants to take full control of their profiles. We did these interviews on Zoom through screen sharing. And so they were able to fluidly jump from profile to profile. I did not encourage them to look at a particular profile, and they were able to select everything that we looked at and discussed. And in this case, what's really important to know about this method is that the profile serves as a memory object. It allows people to recall aspects of the pandemic. In particular, as I asked them to scroll back all the way to March 2020 from when we conducted the interviews in July through December 2021. But the interviews and their recollections are always situated in the interview present. So the recollections of the pandemic are going to be filtered through the current moment of December or July through December 2021. And so in doing this, I think it's just helpful to have a bit of a timeline. So in July of 2021, and this was focused in New York State. So in New York State, I think probably similar to Pennsylvania, July 2021 was a time when people were starting to have access to the vaccine on a large scale, that first vaccine dose or the first two. And then in July of 2021, the Delta variant came about, leading some people to still get COVID despite the vaccine. And then after that, over the next several months up and through December 2021 was when the Omicron variant came about. So overall, this was a time when people were starting to feel they could go back into public, but also that they were still potentially threatened by new variants of COVID-19. So the participants in this study were adult US citizens and social media users who were based in New York State. I used two small samples, or a subsample and a larger sample. The first one was a sample of 11 college students from a New York State research university. And that supported the interview guide development, but also I included them here as well, because I think they contribute something very interesting to the data. And also they are the people who are often known for using social media among the most, or being innovators of social media. And then we also have a larger sample of 37 additional New York State residents recruited using a combination of online forums like Craigslist and Reddit and snowball sampling. And I kept the state and region of this study consistent because pandemic guidelines differed so much between different states, and cultures and norms being so different it was necessary to keep them more consistent. So the result of this sampling process was a total of 48 scroll back interviews, and through the process, I was able to give for everyone to have a chance to scroll back through those first year or so of the pandemic. So first, I know this presentation is not about offline sociality. It's about online sociality. But I want to give you a little context by talking to you about the offline, in-person, face-to-face social aspects of the pandemic that my participants were discussing, which was a part of the interview, but became very compelling over the process of analysis of the data. So some of the things that I noticed that I think color the online data are, first, the idea that my participants discussed using health behaviors as a socio-political shorthand. So participants began to assess how their social interactions could determine whether those around them shared their political beliefs. And for people like Hazel, who is a Democrat, and many of my other more liberal participants, social behaviors associated with masking and vaccines became very socially salient. So she says, sometimes I can tell people's political ideologies based on whether or not they're getting the vaccine. I know it's not like a one size fits all, how they approach social distancing. Are they wearing a mask in public? Now it's hard to tell because a lot of people have forgone the mask, but you could kind of tell. I felt like I was conditioned to perceive people that way because of everything I was hearing and seeing. So she feels conditioned that she can read into a person's pandemic safety behaviors, how are they wearing a mask, in order to determine whether they might share her political beliefs. On the other hand, for more conservative participants, there was a discussion, and not limited to the conservative participants, there was a discussion of behaviors that could be considered as overcautious, too far, too much, too anxious, washing your hands 30 times a day, wearing protective gear in public, such as a hazmat suit, which was mentioned frequently, or wearing gloves. Also, the idea of supporting mask mandates was also seen as way too far. Never leaving the house and not rejoining social life when enough time had passed, as well as the most salient example that many people mentioned was looking into people's car windows and seeing that they were in their car alone wearing a mask, because that suggested to them that there is no point in wearing a mask if there's no one with you. So there was this notion of some people being too cautious or not cautious enough, being telling about a person's social beliefs and pandemic orientation. Next, there was in person and in face-to-face interactions, this notion of anticipating risk. So people feeling that they need to keep their guard up in public and look out for themselves. The central place where this revolved around was the grocery store. The notion of going to the grocery store being a place where people had to go indoors and be together in person, as opposed to most of their other interactions being potentially outdoors or at home. And this anxiety about being in public and being at the grocery store came up in almost every interview. Then at the same time, there was, despite this anxiety, sometimes a sense of transformation and also increased comfort at this sense of anonymity gained from wearing masks and social distancing. For example, one of my participants who was feminine presenting talked about how wearing masks made it so that she was no longer asked to smile in public. And then we see people telegraphing their discontent, finding ways to communicate and convey in order to protect themselves and anticipate risk, their sense of concern or social ostracization of people who are not living the same pandemic guidelines that they are. Kyle called this the old Italian side eye or the old woman side eye. And he said, I give it to anybody who's coughing and stuff near me. Definitely your brain starts going because you have to start thinking about the cost of getting exposed again. So a certain look, a certain way of carrying oneself in public to telegraph a sense that you are not following my pandemic guidelines as I would like you to. Then we also see additional layers of anticipating risk dependent on structures of power and frankly, anti-Asian racism that became much more apparent during the pandemic. So for example, Jocelyn, who was an East Asian woman living in New York City, said, I'm blonde now. I was not blonde before the pandemic started. It's been a really challenging year. I feel much more comfortable being outside now because there's been, I think, a lot of public campaigns, a lot of public support against hate crimes. But for a really long time, I wouldn't even go out to the grocery store. I would rely on my partner, who doesn't look East Asian, to go out and do that. It was really challenging, but I am blonde because for the longest time, like I would be blonde and I would wear sunglasses and you just couldn't tell who I am, so you can't hurt me. So anticipating risk looked different across various different markers of difference, or markers of social identity. So then the final pandemic in-person, face-to-face sociality discussion I want to share with you is related to unlearning and selectively relearning public sociality. This idea that being isolated, being away from many aspects of public life, left people feeling like they forgot how to be in public, and they had unlearned many aspects of the norms and expectations of their public sociality. So they did things like forget how to pay at the store, or felt they forgot how to socialize in person. One person talked extensively about how she forgot to use a credit card machine. And on top of that, this gave people an opportunity. While it was confusing, it was also an opportunity to choose what to relearn and what norms to leave behind. So participants talked about this a lot of times as a sense of a return to their true selves, an opportunity to self-reflect and to learn a new kind of public sociality that suits them. For example, I saw a lot of narratives of self-transformation, people coming out as non-binary among my participants, coming out with sexualities that they did not have before the pandemic, or that they did not openly embrace before the pandemic, and then also changing their self-styling, even on that level, dressing how I want to dress, acting like I want to act in public, things like that. So this chance to relearn, unlearn, and relearn and transform. So now that we have this background of this feeling of unlearning and relearning sociality, of anticipating risk, we can move into questions of the digital self-representation, which I think build off of these. So my analysis is informed by research on symbolic boundaries, which are typically understood as these imagined social boundaries that distinguish groups from one another and forge collective identities through normative cultural practices and preferences. So one social group, women versus men, for example, the things you're supposed to like, the things you're supposed to care about. However, with this project, I draw on Robin Wagner Pacifici's work to examine how symbolic boundaries are not necessarily just about social groups, but can also be drawn between experiences of time and space, experiences of reality, experiences of events like the pandemic. So I found that participants in managing their social media profiles and representing themselves online, they maintained symbolic boundaries between realms of experience to kind of reinterpret their identities during the pandemic. So these boundaries I would specify as between normal life, the sense of everyday, real, routine, pre-pandemic life, and pandemic life, or the crisis, surreal, disruption, tragedy of the pandemic. The sense of having to navigate, how do I get back to normal? What is normal? What is my life now? When can we return to the way things were? So I identified 4 processes of self-representation that show how these boundaries were navigated on people's social media profiles. These include documentation, justification, reinvention, and withdrawal. And I want to specify that in thinking about these boundaries, Wagner Pacifici argues, and I quote, "You cannot have an event without boundaries, and you cannot definitively bind an event." So instead of studying events based on their beginning and endpoints, she studies them as ongoing constructions of power and meaning. And she terms this as the restlessness of events, which it's really about how events are constantly moving and changing. We're constantly reinterpreting them, thinking about them in different ways, representing them in new ways across genres. And in this case, I want to study self-representation during the pandemic as a sort of event restlessness, a way of managing event restlessness, and a restless process in itself. As participants seek to define boundaries between pandemic life and normal life, the practices they use are constantly moving, changing, and colliding. And instead, they can be iterative, recursive, oscillating between different ideas and different actions on social media to manage their identities. All right, so I want to talk to you about these 4 practices, and I'm going to start with the first one, which is called documenting disruption, or I'm alive, so here's me making some bread. And this practice is focused on the idea of purposeful documentation of pandemic life. These personal pandemic histories that people use to remember, connect, and cope with the change of pandemic life, seeing it as preserving a historic moment and creating things like visual pandemic diaries through photos or vlogs, similar to Gobin's work on the online lockdown diaries and endurance in Wuhan, China. But this, of course, was a little bit different, based in a very different context, and also not necessarily nearly as consistent. A lot of people used purposeful documentation of the pandemic to mark periods of change rather than consistently representing the pandemic over and over again. They were doing things like taking photos of themselves baking bread, taking photos of themselves working from home. One of my participants, whose Instagram feed is depicted here, Nora, did actually take a daily Instagram photo for about 200 days of her lockdown life. She was alone, so she used this as an opportunity to connect with other people. But I think that this quote from Kayla really encapsulates what documenting disruption is all about. We did take a picture without the mask and with it, because I love history, right? And I'm like, we need to document that where we're wearing masks this time. I want some pictures with masks on, because in 100 years, if anybody's looking at our stuff, they're going to say, oh, look, they were wearing masks then. I'm like, I want to see, well, I probably won't be alive, but I want people to see all the different emotions of what we went through. And I want to note that Kayla did not believe in masks. Kayla wanted to get back to normal as quick as possible. She here is talking about a bit of an earlier stage in the pandemic than the 2021 interview that we did, but she didn't support masking as her political beliefs were calling it into question for her. But at the same time, she felt a need to document this moment for history, for posterity. She was asking her daughter to keep a journal about pandemic life. And so we see Kayla kind of thinking about how to best document this disruption. And so I mentioned earlier that the practice of documenting disruption was something that people did to mark changes. They did things like posting photo dumps on Instagram, which are essentially collections of photos that show moments at a period of change, or sometimes just a period of capturing a period of one's life. They did things like, taking photos of themselves working from home, as I said. And then as that came up mostly as we started to scroll backward. So as we scrolled backward, as I was experiencing people's profiles, that was one of the things that I would see last, because I was coming from maybe July 2021, all the way to March 2020. So the tendency was that people would engage in this documentation of pandemic life right at the beginning, and then probably not any later. But I did see one place where the documentation of disruption was happening a little bit later. And this was when people began taking vaccine selfies to mark yet another change in their pandemic lives. The idea that this could be the beginning of the end for those who wanted to be vaccinated, or a new normal. And so there was this resurgence of pandemic commemoration as people took vaccine selfies that depicted them with their vaccine card or with a Band-Aid on their arm or actually getting vaccinated. And the question of vaccine selfies became a bit of an interesting one because while the vaccine selfies are this performance of the opportunity to get vaccinated, they can have this sense that they're showing a good civic behavior. They were also criticized by many of my participants as an opportunity to flex or brag, show off that you've had access to the vaccine, which was not exclusive for everyone at any given time, or an opportunity to virtue signal, show off these good behaviors in a way that isn't necessarily meant to contribute anything except something for oneself, or the general sense that they were cringy. And one of my favorite moments from the study was when my participant Skylar talked to me about who takes selfies, who takes vaccine selfies. So Skylar said, not to be mean to you, me, because I just met you, but I'm thinking you totally seem like the person who would do that. So me, but I did not post a vaccine selfie because I didn't want to be cringy. I have my vaccine card. I mean, I could. So yes, I'll own that. I think it's important as a researcher that one, Skylar told me that, and two, the reflexivity of being a white person, feminine presenting, doing this work. So Skylar went on to describe who takes these selfies. Usually white, usually left wing or liberal, either cis, woman or non-binary person, just usually like a white ally type, just usually a white leftist person who can scroll through their profile. Oh, there's the Black Lives Matter frame. Oh, there's no hate here frame, the love trumps hate frame. Oh, there's the LGBTQ frame, just being real as a trans woman of color like myself. So this notion of who gets to take a vaccine selfie, and this doesn't necessarily mean, of course, this is just Skylar's assumption about who takes a vaccine selfie, brings up important points about how documenting disruption can play out and what it means on social media. So for each of these, going off of the sense that these events, these self-presentational practices are restless, I want to give you a little timeline. So for the documenting disruption, as I said, I saw it kind of coming up at the very beginning of the pandemic. There was this sense that, we have to document these changes to our lives. We have to keep track. But then after a certain amount of adjustment period, these changes began to feel more normalized. They also began to feel more exhausting and stressful as life did not go back to normal as quick as anyone expected. And then the sense of documenting disruption, documenting pandemic life, it kind of just went away after a certain amount of time. And that differed for different participants. But with some people then, when the vaccine became available, the desire to document the change to life came back, at least for a little bit. So the second practice of self-representation I want to talk to you about is the idea of performing justifications. Everything I did for a reason. And this is the idea of visually and textually justifying photos or posts that show potentially risky behaviors to one's imagined social media audience. Regardless of your beliefs about masks or social distancing, or in general, how to live life during COVID-19, there was always a sense of anticipating whether someone's social your social network might differ in their beliefs from your own self-representation. So you might have deemed a situation safe enough to post about, but my participants were always wondering and thinking about how to make sure that their social network, no matter what their beliefs were, would not question their behavior, including whether it be friends or their boss. Or some other institutional actors. So this included this anticipation leading to practices like staging photos that appear safe. I'll talk about that in a second. Withholding photos or posts until they seem safer. So I took this photo at a time when there was a mask mandate or it didn't feel safe to be at this event. And then I posted it a few months later when it seemed safer then. Or going on vacation, waiting to post about it until it's a little bit more okay in the norm of what kinds of things people can do in public. And also, most prominently, maybe iconically, I saw contextual justifications in the captions. They need to explain what is going on in this photo to make sure it's safe. Don't worry, we just took off our masks for the photo. Don't worry, we're all vaccinated, so it's okay that we're here. These kinds of contextual justifications having to explain the background of the photo were very prominent. So I think that this quote from June here really encapsulates the politics of visibility in pandemic era social media photos. And these two quotes, while they are from the same students at the same college, I don't know if they're actually talking about the same event, but I think they play together anyway. So June is talking about a trip that some people in her social network went on to Miami. When people weren't vaccinated, there was a trip to Miami and it caused an outbreak. Everyone wasn't perfect. The pandemic did not mean that you needed to be perfect in your behavior. You just needed to be okay. Arguably, going to Miami wasn't okay, but to each his own. But you then posted about it. You made it visually open for other people to see. During a pandemic, making that behavior known to your social circles, I just feel like that's indicative of some type of character that I'm not cool with. Then we have Anna, who went to Miami during the early months of the pandemic. And she says, I'm a good citizen. I did everything to not harm anybody else. So when I was in Florida, I was prepared. I was like, if somebody does say something, I can explain myself. I'm not wearing a mask in this photo because I'm next to the two people that I shared a bed with last night. So being prepared to explain yourself, being a good citizen. These are questions of self-justification and representation during the pandemic. And then we have practices of staging photos specifically. Staging is an age-old photographic practice. We see it documented, for example, in Paul Maceris's work on visual persuasion, and it involves choreographing photos to convey a particular sort of impression. It's commonly on social media associated with inauthenticity and even falsified visual content. And so a common practice during the pandemic was to stage safe photos. Make a photo look safe by putting on a mask. If you're in a group photo, make sure you got a mask on. At one point, Mara, one of my participants, told me that she had just taken a candid photo of her dad walking around, and he said, hey, can you delete that? We need to have me with a mask for this photo. I don't want you posting this without the mask. And then the opposite was also true. People would stage normalcy as well. So going somewhere, being in a group, all are wearing masks, and then taking the masks off for the photo in order to kind of connect with the idea that the pandemic was not forever. There's potential for a normal life. The memory not being tainted by the idea of wearing masks was something that was important to people when they wanted to show a sense that their photos were actually normal, no signs of the pandemic visually present. So in this case, in terms of like a bit of a timeline for performing justifications of your pandemic behavior on social media means you need to know what the social norms of pandemic behavior are and what the expectations of your social network are. So there was this sense of needing a bit of an adjustment period to become aware of the pandemic social norms, and also to become a little more bored with the pandemic sort of life changes. And so I would speculate or discuss this timeline as kind of beginning for performing justifications a little bit later on into the pandemic, differing for different people, but people began performing justifications after they felt this more social awareness. So the third process I want to talk to you about is the idea of reflection, amplification, and reinvention, or the chance to push some helpful information on your social media. So this practice is related to the idea of self-transformation and self-reflection, leading people to want to recurate, repurpose, and change their social media presence. And in this case, generally away from personal life, no longer talking about themselves so much and using their social media for an alternative purpose. So this is a very curatorial practice that involves cleaning up and overthinking profiles after having more time for self-reflection. So people sitting down, thinking about what belongs here, going through and deleting a few photos, deleting all those embarrassing photos from high school, maybe. And then also, in addition to that, there was, for some people, a more extreme repurposing of profiles, completely changing the purpose. So maybe taking a personal profile and making it a professional profile, or in one case, deleting everything on the profile and turning it into a StudyGram account, or an account that is used to connect with other people who are studying the aesthetics of doing homework, complete reinvention of the profile. Or even more prominently, there was this notion of externalizing the focus of one's profile onto other people and social causes. For example, externalizing it onto activism and social justice, or community mutual aid, and finding a way to amplify and focus on others. So for example, Jeremy said, so I find that just revealing less about myself and less about what I'm doing on social media is kind of like moving in silence, which I feel is more important, very important nowadays. And Maura also said something similar. Before, I feel like I would just post random stuff, whatever I was thinking about that day. Now I'm like, is it really even that important? So now I feel like I post more important things rather than just flippant, oh, this is what I'm eating today and stuff. I try to push some helpful information rather than just being all about me. So in this case, there isn't necessarily a start or end time for the feeling of reflection and amplification, though I think a lot of people, as the Black Lives Matter movement happened during those early times of the pandemic, were considering that, especially in their decision to change their profiles. But there was a sense that as there's time to reflect, there is a chance to gradually, or even with a particular turning point, change and alter what that profile will look like. And so the last practice I want to talk to you about is the notion of obscuring and withdrawing identities. When people are dying, how do we post on social media, this in the sense of tragedy? So this practice is really related to the idea of avoiding social media and avoiding self-representation, pulling back and pulling away, whether that be because of particular struggles with the pandemic, including grief and economic insecurity, stress, health issues, or just feeling like posting is tone deaf and not appropriate during a tough tragedy and tough time. Another way that people justified this was deeming pandemic life unworthy of self-representation. It doesn't matter enough to be worth putting on my profile. And even going so far as to recursively delete and then reopen profiles over and over again when things felt more normal. For example, with some of the college students, when they went back to school in person, they felt it was time to reinstate profiles they had deleted. And so just to give some examples of this, we have Jocelyn saying, it was reading the room on social media. It's about, is it appropriate to post about this when people are dying? We also have Harper who says, there was so little going on in my day-to-day life that it's just like, what am I going to post about? There are no updates. Nobody cares to see the quarantine selfie where it's the same picture of me, the same spot in my house, just like time lapse. Nobody needs to see that. And so with this final practice, there's really a sense that it could be immediate, it differed for different people, but that it was often alternating and oscillating. At one point, there's a sense of complete withdrawal, but then coming back and returning and leaving again. Some people felt they had left, but realized that they needed to come back for various reasons to social media or to posting about their lives online. And so I want to note here specifically a little bit about the profile itself. So profiles were these spaces for compiling pandemic histories, but the scroll back interviews also offered opportunities for self-reflection. And it allowed me to reflect as well on how profiles actually serve to compile our personal histories. I found, you can see my profiles here, Facebook is very bad for looking at personal histories because there's no way, if someone knows of one, let me know, but I could not find one, no way to easily click back to different points in your timeline. You have to scroll straightforwardly backward, and that can take a very long time. It can be difficult. And so it's hard to revisit your past on Facebook. Whereas on Instagram, for example, the interface allows you to easily revisit your past posts. And I even had one participant who, during the process, she at first said, I never post. I completely stopped posting on Facebook. I completely withdrew everything from Facebook. And it was easy at first. We went through to December 2020. In about 2 seconds, there was nothing there. But then there were so many posts after a little bit that she couldn't even scroll back to the beginning of her profile because it became so populated. So on one hand, she had no awareness of her past posting because it was not apparent. And also, it's worth noting how the interview process of the scrollback interviews shaped people's awareness of their profiles, which this process is both naturalistic in a sense, in that we can see what people's profiles look like to them, but also it is worth acknowledging that it is an analytic process that encourages people to look at their profiles in a way they typically wouldn't. And so just a couple of quick conclusions before we finish up today. The first thing I want to talk about is earlier I mentioned symbolic boundaries, and this idea that people enforce these imagined separations between things like normal life and pandemic life. And I found that ultimately, with both of the offline practices of engagement and interaction that people were utilizing, as well as those online practices of documentation, reflection, justification, and withdrawing, there was a sense that the ways that people manage the boundaries between normal life and pandemic life were also socially meaningful. And so the boundaries of time became also boundaries between social groups. When can we go back to normal was a question that differed in its answer across many different participants. The question really became, who are we equivocated with? How do we cope in this moment? And temporal boundary management here became a social shorthand in itself, online and off. There was also this question of resisting or reveling in pandemic disruption. Who is able to get excited about the disruption of the pandemic? Who is able to document and share how the pandemic has changed their lives? And who chooses not to or actively resists the idea of documenting or sharing or who is unable to document and share how the pandemic has disrupted or changed their lives or share their lives during the pandemic? These things became important questions about how we manage boundaries and how different groups and individuals can manage their boundaries. So with these practices of self-representation, we see that a couple of things. Firstly, there's the notion of documentation, justification, reinvention, and withdrawing. I see these things as very similar to existing practices on social media, such as curation, such as recording daily life, or editing posts and photos, editing and adjusting impressions. And so one thing that came about for me as I analyzed this data was the sense that these practices are not necessarily entirely new, but they do enable isolated individuals to connect with wider collective groups and narratives, or choose to disconnect. But by highlighting the chasm between normal life and pandemic life, they also underscored the difficulty of participants' attempts to move on and go back to normal. For example, the idea of performing justifications is rooted in a desire to showcase normal life events, just hanging out with friends, living through life milestones like graduations, even if they might be a little unsafe. But there is also a constant need to keep modulating the ways that people try to return to normal life so that they could adjust to standards of online social networks. So this sort of restlessness of digital self-representation meant that people tried to use self-representation to document the pandemic or show that they were going back to normal, but the opinions and thoughts of others and even the platforms themselves could curtail this ability. In terms of where this research is headed, I have plans to continue it through the current era of the pandemic and how people remember a pandemic that is now over, we're at 3 years on at this point. How would people reinterpret their pandemic social media today? Also, there's an opportunity to engage in cross-cultural comparison within the US or internationally, and even to zoom out on pandemic self-representational practices through larger groups of social media images and the types of things that people would do there. So the question I posed at the beginning, did the pandemic actually alter the fabric of identity-based digital storytelling on social media? My answer to this question is yes and no. On one hand, it demonstrates for us, how do people alter their behavior when there's this large-scale change to impression management and social norms? But at the same time, the practices that participants were using to navigate the pandemic were not new inventions. Instead, they involved reinterpreting, relearning, and remixing existing strategies of impression management and self-representation in order to adjust to pandemic life. And that is what I wanted to share with you today. Love to hear if you have any questions. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Chelsea, for the fascinating talk by presenting so many rich stories. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the career background of your interviewees in addition to the students, because I can feel that sometimes if you are an essential worker yourself, your life kind of continues and you still have to have offline interaction with your clients and also personally work with activists and social workers in Philly here. And many of them will still take photos of them appearing sometimes in like protests, in working with their client, even in the most peak of the pandemic, just to signal that they're part of special workforce or part of special like activist group. And I wonder if you have interaction with this kind of.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I would love to chat with you more about that another time too. And your research sounds really fascinating. Yeah, in terms of career background, I think you're absolutely right that especially the configuration of am I working in person or am I working from home or am I not working is incredibly important. And I talked to people who really there were a combination of different backgrounds in terms of careers. Because of my recruitment methods, I think a good amount of people did work from home. I was using online recruitment methods, including Craigslist, and I did pay my participants. So I think that is important to note. But at the same time, several of my participants, many of them, continued to have jobs working in person. So, for example, I had participants who worked at a gas station. One of them worked at a gas station, having to deal with people having different pandemic values and safety practices at their workplace was really difficult. And I think in terms of the types of careers that you are talking about, actually, I don't think I saw that as much with my participants, but I think that it's probably part of my recruitment strategy that was missing some of that. But I think even for those who continue to work in person, I would agree with my in terms of the participants I did see that it didn't necessarily mean, even though their life continued, it didn't necessarily mean that they stopped engaging in self-representation or that they fundamentally changed it either. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. I have a question that's kind of prompted by my admiration of your kind of ethnographic interview skills. A lot of the quotes that you showed us were just like great.
Thank you.
But I had a question about how you think about two kinds of observer effects. So one being your participants' perception of you and your politics and whatever they might assume about you. And secondly, how the, how you describe it, analytic process of the scroll back interview might shape the kinds of observations you can make of that, because as you noted, it's a somewhat unusual way of interacting with one's own profile. So how do you think of this as like an obstacle, or do you think of it as something that changes the types of questions you ask, or how do you conceptualize those events?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you. So I think that, I think of it as the reality of my interview situation, but I think the ways that I try to manage that, one, I think in calling this method I'm using, scroll back interviewing, is focused on this idea of participants as co-analysts, which is very idealistic and beautiful, whatever. But of course, it's flawed in some ways because every interview interaction has a power dynamic, which is layered on top of one's own positionality and what can be seen about that person. And so I think part of it was how I framed the interviews to the participants in an attempt to talk about what our goal was. And I don't think that it fully addressed, this dynamic, but I tried to talk to them about, I had a script about how we were analyzing their social media together. I was asking them to look at it in a different way. I wanted them to have full control. And also, I think biggest thing that can be done to address this, which, in all my write-ups of this, I plan to include is, reflexivity as a key part, not just in the methods section, but throughout the entire project, including, we get close like the one that I shared with you where, participants are gauging me against the practices we're talking about, which, maybe I'm asking about it because that is part of who I am, So I think acknowledging that at every step of the way is really an important part of the process.
Thank you so much for this. The methods are fascinating. I might have missed this, but so on the 4 platforms you're looking at with your respondents, analysts, what have you, was it sort of like they showed you one profile on one particular platform, or did you get a chance to see their profiles on like different platforms that they were using?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I gave them full control and I asked them, for some of them, they showed me just one, and for some of them, they showed me multiple. So I didn't want to standardize it, even though, maybe there would be some potential gains to that. But I wanted them to think about, which profile shows their pandemic stories. And sometimes for them, they would say, like, this naturally leads me to my next profile. Mm-hmm. This idea on Facebook makes me go to Twitter. And for some of them, like my participant who couldn't remember how much she had posted, we were racing. We spent 20 minutes of her just scrolling back on Facebook through hundreds of posts that she had shared in like March 2020. So it kind of depended in this situation on both the participants' preferences, ideas about what their profiles mean to them, and also the actual like interface and the platform we were interacting with and how quickly it enabled us. The interviews were between 60 and 90 minutes, but even so, I wanted to ask them questions around the profile analysis too. So there were both technical limitations and also their own preferences. Yeah.
Just for a future question, because you were talking about the difficulty of locating dates on the Facebook timeline. Mm-hmm. So I was curious, do you think as you go on your research, will time hop become relevant, right? Like the thing that shows a screenshot of the year, like a day before, a year ago or years ago, right? I was just curious if that has any relevance to, like, because it was curious, right? Like, because people can reflect 3 years later on something that happened, right? I was just curious if that had, I don't know. That was much of a question.
No, that's a great point. And I think something I've been considering too, I'll go back, if I can go back a couple slides, thinking about like, can I study this now? If it took 20 minutes to scroll back in like 2 years ago, so I think I am actively, because most of the participants, especially if I want to be inclusive about things like age, a lot of them are using Facebook. Those who are, over a certain age will tend to use Facebook and not necessarily have a lot of technical skills to navigate it, but even so, they don't have the option. So I think time hop could be a really interesting opportunity. I think there are some like things in the back end of Facebook you can use to kind of access a very different altered version of your profile, which I have to think about whether that's something I want to encourage my participants to do. I think the scrolling process is really a tactile part of this interview. So I think, that's a great point. Maybe time hop is something I should explore. Yeah.
I kind of have 2 smaller questions. So I'm curious if you decided on the scroll back interview method, like if there had been any thought about it or to use it before the pandemic. Like I guess I'm the timeline of like you making the decision to study this and like study it this way. Yeah. So that's my first question. And then I'm also interested in what sort of questions are guiding the sort of like cross-cultural international perspective you want to bring to a future iteration of this project. Like, what do you hope to find, and like again, what sort of distinct questions?
Those are great questions. So to address the first question, so the process for me, this method originated before the pandemic, and it was used by Sean Robards to study how teenagers look at and recontextualize and reinterpret their Facebook profiles from the past in their present. So as thinking about adolescent development and the ways that teenagers understand themselves was important to where this came from. And so as I was thinking about studying the pandemic, there were a couple of things. I was actually already doing a project on the 2020 election where I scrolled through people's social media feeds with them, which is kind of it's not the same method, but it is connected in that it's these like self-confrontational methods or co-analytic methods, which I think can, again, sound really noble in some way, but actually, every method has challenges and they're all constructed in these different ways. So I saw the kind of synergy between the feed analysis I was doing and the existing idea from this existing study of adolescence on how reflecting on a period of time through the profile can be kind of a unique way to look at it and how people recontextualize and interpret their practices in the present. And so that was what led me to choose this method, was seeing the progression of life during the pandemic and the way that people could catalog it and then reflect upon it through methods I was already using and also my awareness of this pre-existing method. And then in terms of questions about cross-cultural analysis, whether that be between US states or between different countries, I think what really motivates that for me is thinking about how different social regulations and expectations of pandemic life were constructed differently. For example, between a strict blue state and a red state, or between different cultures, US versus, let's say, maybe Australia or China, or places where the pandemic lockdowns or pandemic norms could mean something different. And so I think combining the self-reflection process with the different institutional and cultural norms of pandemic life is what I'm trying to get at with those future directions.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So this is really fascinating, Chelsea. Thank you so much. The 4 processes you identify: documentation. The second one is I think these are really, really important. But I was particularly struck by the first 2 processes, so much so I almost thought, the restlessness idea is also important. Here, self-representation or self-presentation on social media almost becomes a project of self-justification. Mm-hmm. Because if we think about Goffman's work about self-presentation, you do not have to justify how you perform yourself on the everyday basis. Mm-hmm. It's natural to a certain extent, right? Because you've absorbed the norms and the scripts of how to behave in the public, how to perform to others. But here it's just everything is so disrupted in so many ways. I think I like the idea of restlessness as well. Mm-hmm. That it's almost like the whole project of self-presentation has become disrupted.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you're saying that almost like all of the practices could potentially be kind of absorbed in the idea of like justifying your, I really like that.
I thought that my immediate response is self-presentation as self-justification. Yeah. Documentation is also important in the sense that you really, what comes across to me is the ideological nature of all these issues, right? You have to, I remember several of your quotes. People talk about Democrats, Republicans, left and right. It's in this kind of everyday social media self-presentation is suffused with the language of ideology, which I think is also very impressive. Very important to analyze. I think it's related to the idea of justification. Mm-hmm. Why did it happen this way?
Yeah.
So
why did it become justification?
Exactly. Yeah. Why does kind of the practices of everyday presentation become practice of self-justification?
Yeah, that is a great question. This is giving me a lot to think about. I would say, it's making me think about that. Maybe that is kind of the main process that's starting to happen here. The sense that, as you were saying, normally we're so used to and accustomed to the sense of self presentation as it is, but then, this additional layer of having to justify making yourself visible. So thinking about it in relation to kind of visibility and authenticity, as well as almost thinking about it in terms of risk as well. What kinds of risky self-presentations are worth representing, worth sharing? What makes there's almost this idea in self-representation at all times that we need to justify it because there are cultural norms surrounding creating, sharing everyday life online suggest, why would you share that? That's just an avocado toast. That's stupid. That's just a selfie. That's dumb. But then this additional layer of needing to justify your desire to share a time in life when there is this additional reasons why it should be potentially kept private, or it is potentially dangerous or unsafe. I think that adds another layer to the everydayness of self-representation online. Is my first thought, but it's giving me a lot to think about, and I want to think about it more. So thank you.
Yeah, I think this is really, really fascinating. There's so many things going on here.
Yeah.
You have other questions?
I have a less silly question. The reason I wanted to ask for the profiles, when people have like animal ones, like pet ones,
Like profiles for their pets.
where they have like a different profile for the cat, but clearly like the cat isn't the one tweeting or whatever. Like, I'm wondering if you met, like, if any one of your interviews was one of those people, or if it's just like the status quo.
I don't think so, but they did have like profiles for like more boring things, like they're, one of them was like a physical therapist, or like her physical therapy practice. But yeah, and all of those different profiles also to change. Are you interested because like how did they change the way they represent their pet?
Yeah, there's like self-representation. Wondering, yeah.
Yeah.
Does it extend to your pet's sense?
I would imagine yes. I would imagine yes. I think so. But yeah, I didn't see anyone who had those, or they hid it from me, and I'm very mad if they did.
Well, on that note, let's thank Chelsea again for